The courtroom pulsed with a quiet intensity, a tension thick enough to weigh down the air. Conversations, hushed yet persistent, rippled through the crowd as more people filled the wooden benches, their eyes darting toward the defendant's table. The anticipation in the room was electric. People weren't just here for a trial. They were here to witness a reckoning. Then he arrived. Ethan Grayson. The name had been splashed across headlines for weeks. A man of immense wealth, power, and influence, standing accused of defrauding countless hardworking Americans. Yet, as he walked through the courtroom doors, his demeanor was anything but that of a man facing judgment. He moved with an easy confidence, his broad shoulders squared beneath an immaculately tailored charcoal gray suit. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate, exuding an aura of entitlement. The fluorescent lights caught the slick sheen of his perfectly combed back hair, giving him an almost cinematic glow. But it was the smirk, that unshaken, self-assured expression, that truly unsettled the room. He wasn't just unbothered. He looked amused, as if the entire proceeding was nothing more than a tedious formality, before he walked free. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Eyes narrowed. Some shook their heads, others whispered indignantly. But all watched as he made his way to the defense table and took his seat, his posture as relaxed as if he were in a boardroom, not a courtroom. Then the moment that stunned the entire room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and commanding. In unison, the entire courtroom stood, the collective rustle of fabric and the shuffle of shoes filling the space. A show of respect for the authority about to preside over the trial. Everyone rose, except for one man. Ethan remained seated. He flipped idly through a legal pad, his expression indifferent, his fingers lightly tapping against the pages, as if he had something far more pressing to attend to. His lawyer, sitting beside him, leaned in urgently, whispering what was no doubt a plea to get up. But Ethan merely waved him off, his smirk deepening as though he found the entire situation amusing. The tension in the room thickened, eyes widening in disbelief. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one in their right mind would dare defy the courtroom's most fundamental sign of respect, especially not in front of Judge Monica Lee. And yet here he was. Judge Lee entered, her black robe flowing behind her as she stepped forward with measured authority. She wasn't one for theatrics, nor did she need to be. Her reputation spoke for itself, a woman of unwavering integrity, a force in the judicial system known for her keen intellect and ironclad commitment to justice. Her presence alone demanded respect, not through words, but through the weight of her very existence in that courtroom. She took her seat, her eyes finally meeting Ethan's. The room, already silent, somehow grew even quieter, the kind of silence that pressed into the very bones of those present. Ethan didn't flinch. He barely glanced at her. The blatant disrespect wasn't just a personal slight. It was a statement, a declaration that he believed himself untouchable, that rules were for other people, and that no matter how serious the charges, no matter the weight of the evidence, he would walk out of that courtroom the same way he walked in, unscathed and undefeated. Judge Lee's expression remained unreadable, but something in the air shifted. A quiet storm gathered behind her eyes, a cold calculation beneath her composed exterior. The moment stretched, the weight of her gaze pressing down on Ethan like an unseen force. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for her response. And that was the moment Ethan made his first mistake, underestimating Monica Lee. He had spent a lifetime bending the system to his will. He had bought influence, sidestepped regulations, and manipulated those in power. But as he sat there, smug and unconcerned, he failed to recognize the one truth that had finally caught up to him. Not everyone can be bought. This trial would be different. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson was about to face something he had never truly known before: justice. Ethan Grayson wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of rich that turned heads and dominated news cycles. His face graced the covers of financial magazines, his name whispered in circles of power and influence. Grayson Investments, his empire, was marketed as a beacon of hope for middle-class families, small business owners, and retirees. He sold them dreams of security, promising them a chance at a future where their hard-earned money would work for them. But dreams, when built on deception, crumble into nightmares. For those who had trusted him, the reality was devastating. Families who had placed their life savings in his hands watched everything disappear. Mortgage payments went unpaid. Businesses shuttered their doors forever. Elderly couples who had envisioned peaceful retirements found themselves scrambling to make ends meet. Some lost their homes, their dignity, and their faith in the system. Ethan, however, remained untouchable, at least for a while. While his victims lay awake at night wondering how they would survive, he reveled in his wealth. He sipped aged whiskey on private jets, hosted extravagant parties in his sprawling Malibu estate, and sailed on luxury yachts, his laughter ringing through the night. To him, it was just business. Numbers on a page. Faces he would never have to look at again. But justice has a way of catching up with even the most untouchable. When the authorities finally closed in, the evidence was undeniable. Thousands of falsified documents, carefully concealed offshore accounts, internal emails detailing the fraud. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. His empire wasn't built on strategy or brilliance. It was built on lies. As the trial commenced, the weight of his crimes should have crushed him. But Ethan Grayson was nothing if not consistent. He walked into that courtroom with the same arrogance that had defined his life. His tailored suit was pristine, his hair styled to perfection. He smirked as he passed the gallery, unaffected by the sea of devastated faces staring back at him. The prosecution wasted no time. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices trembling with emotion as they relived their losses. They weren't just numbers in a scandal. They were people whose lives had been upended. Their stories painted a harrowing picture of deception, betrayal, and ruin. And through it all, Ethan remained unmoved. He sat back in his chair, his expression one of sheer boredom. He whispered to his lawyer, barely concealing his smirk. Occasionally, he scrolled through his phone, indifferent to the pain unraveling before him. It was as if he were watching a tedious movie he had no interest in. Then, Angela Martinez took the stand. She was a widow, a mother of 3, a woman who had worked 2 jobs to build a future for her children. She had invested everything she had into Grayson Investments, believing the promises Ethan's company had made. And in return, she had lost it all. Her voice broke as she described the day she had to tell her children they had no home. "I begged them not to take the house," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the witness stand. Tears streamed down her face. "We lived in our car for 2 weeks. My kids, they deserved better." The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet sniffling of those who understood her pain. A collective ache hung in the air. Ethan, he barely looked up. He tapped his fingers against the table, as if waiting for the moment to pass. Not a flicker of remorse crossed his face. His arrogance was astonishing. For the first time, though, there was a shift in the room. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Judge Monica Lee's stare grew colder. This trial wasn't just about financial fraud anymore. It was about something deeper: decency, humanity, the basic understanding that actions have consequences. Ethan had spent his life believing the rules did not apply to him. But sitting in that courtroom, beneath the weight of countless shattered lives, the question lingered. How much longer could he outrun justice? The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension as the prosecutor methodically placed a stack of printed emails onto the evidence table. The jurors leaned forward, some adjusting their glasses, others casting sideways glances at Ethan Grayson, who sat at the defense table with an almost lazy posture. He idly smoothed the sleeve of his designer suit as if this entire ordeal were no more than a minor inconvenience. Then the prosecutor spoke. "We have uncovered direct correspondence from Mr. Grayson to his executive team, proving without a shadow of a doubt that this fraud was not a mistake, not an oversight, but a deliberate, calculated deception." The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment settling over the room like a heavy fog. Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, clutched her chest as if trying to steady her breath. Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter who had lost everything, clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor cleared their throat and read the email aloud. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." A collective gasp filled the space. rippling through the gallery like a wave. Whispers spread like wildfire, a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Angela's lips quivered, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Peter, a man who had spent his life running into burning buildings, now found himself watching his future go up in flames at the hands of a man who barely seemed to care. "Ethan?" He smirked, that same smug, self-satisfied expression he had worn since the first day of the trial. He leaned back, tilting his chair ever so slightly, his fingers tapping idly against the table. If he was concerned, he certainly didn't show it. The prosecutor turned to him, voice sharp. "Mr. Grayson, do you deny writing this email?" A pause. Then Ethan leaned toward the microphone, exhaling slowly, as if this entire process was exhausting him. "Let's not pretend this means what you're implying," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, incredulous shakes of the head. Judge Monica Lee's gavel struck down like a hammer against stone, the sharp crack cutting through the noise, like lightning splitting the sky. Order in the court. Slowly, the murmurs subsided, but the energy had shifted. The jury exchanged glances, some nodding, others setting their jaws in quiet determination. They had seen fraud trials before, but never had they witnessed such unrepentant arrogance, such blatant disregard for the people who had lost everything. Judge Lee's piercing gaze locked onto Ethan. "Mr. Grayson, I strongly advise you to watch your tone." Ethan's smirk remained, but his posture shifted slightly. A flicker of something, was it unease? Passed across his features before he masked it with his usual air of indifference. He adjusted his tie, then leaned back again, unwilling to let anyone see a crack in his composure. The prosecutor continued, their voice unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a man who made an honest mistake. This is not a man who was misled by his associates. This is a man who deliberately manipulated hardworking people, who stole their futures while he lived in unimaginable luxury." Angela swallowed hard, her hands gripping the bench in front of her. Peter exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. The weight of their stories, their pain, their losses, it filled the room, suffocating, undeniable. And yet, Ethan was still grinning. The trial continued, but something had changed. The once neutral faces in the jury now held something more, a quiet resolve, a growing certainty. They had entered this courtroom expecting to weigh facts and evidence. Now they were seeing something they hadn't anticipated, an unrepentant fraudster who didn't just steal, but mocked the very people he had destroyed. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson was beginning to realize that his money, his connections, his power, none of it would save him from what was coming next. Angela Martinez took a deep breath, steadying herself as she approached the witness stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had waited for this day, waited for the chance to tell her story, to face the man who had taken everything from her. But standing here now, under the courtroom's glaring lights, her voice wavered. "I trusted him," she began, barely above a whisper. "He destroyed my future." A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on her, except for one. Ethan Grayson. He sat at the defense table, reclined in his chair, his expression detached, fingers tapping lightly against his phone screen. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but he barely acknowledged it. Whatever was on that device seemed far more important than the testimony unfolding before him. The prosecutor cleared their throat and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant is clearly not paying attention." The tension in the room shifted, the murmurs in the gallery growing louder. Judge Monica Lee, who had maintained an unreadable expression throughout much of the trial, now set her gaze squarely on Ethan. Her voice, calm but icy, cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone measured, unwavering, "put your phone away." Ethan barely lifted his head, casting her a brief glance before returning his attention to his screen. "I was just checking something important," he muttered, barely concealing his irritation. A pause. Then, the judge's tone hardened, each syllable sharp and deliberate. I said now. A beat passed before Ethan finally sighed, setting the phone down on the table with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. His posture screamed defiance, as if he were an unruly teenager rather than a man on trial for fraud. But the damage was already done. This trial had never been just about fraud. It had become a testament to power, entitlement, and the consequences of unchecked arrogance. For weeks, the jury had watched Ethan's cavalier behavior, his smirks, his dismissive gestures, his utter lack of remorse. But today, something shifted. The gallery murmured, and the jurors exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. A few of them, once neutral, now sat a little straighter, their expressions hardened. Angela, watching from the witness stand, felt a familiar sting of disbelief. Even now, after everything, he couldn't muster the decency to acknowledge the pain he had caused. She exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of the paper in her hands. I lost my home, she continued, her voice steadier now. I lost everything I worked for. And you. She turned her gaze on Ethan, who finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. You sat in an office and played with people's lives like it was a game. Ethan blinked but said nothing. The courtroom was silent again, but this time, the weight of it felt different. He shifted in his chair, straightening his suit jacket as though brushing off the moment. The prosecutor took a step forward. Mrs. Martinez, can you describe the impact of Mr. Grayson's actions on your family? Angela inhaled, closing her eyes briefly before answering. My kids and I lived in our car for weeks. My youngest daughter cried every night, asking when we could go home, and I couldn't give her an answer. A low murmur swept through the courtroom. The reality of her words sank in, settling over the space like a heavy fog. The prosecutor let the silence linger before turning back to Ethan. And what do you have to say about that, Mr. Grayson? Ethan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping his client would remain silent. But Ethan never could resist the last word. He gave a small shrug, exhaling through his nose before responding. It's unfortunate, he said, his tone flat. But people take risks. Some win, some lose. That's business. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispered curses, a few muffled exclamations from the gallery. Even the court stenographer paused momentarily before resuming. Judge Lee's gavel came down hard. Enough. The courtroom stilled once more, but the air crackled with tension. The judge leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the bench. Mr. Grayson, let me be absolutely clear. This is not a boardroom negotiation. This is a court of law, and you are being held accountable for your actions. Do not mistake this for a game. Ethan clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. The judge turned back to the prosecutor. You may proceed. Angela nodded slightly, gathering her strength. She wasn't just telling her story for herself. She was speaking for every person Ethan had wronged, for every family who had suffered at his hands. And this time, it felt like people were finally listening. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, every breath held in suspense. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper as Judge Monica Lee adjusted the sentencing documents before her. The weight of what was about to be said pressed down on the room, making every moment stretch unbearably long. Then, her voice rang out, firm and unwavering. Ethan Grayson, you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. A collective hush swept through the gallery. The verdict was expected, yet hearing the words aloud made it real. Some victims let out a quiet sigh of relief. Others simply stared ahead, absorbing the finality of what had just been declared. Judge Lee continued, her tone steady and unyielding. You have shown a blatant lack of remorse. You have insulted your victims and disregarded this court's authority. Ethan sat motionless at the defense table. For the first time in the trial, his smirk had vanished. His arms remained crossed, his jaw clenched. A muscle in his cheek twitched, but he said nothing. His lawyer, sitting beside him, had already begun furiously scribbling notes, no doubt preparing for the next steps. But there would be no delaying this moment. Then came the words that sent a shockwave through the courtroom. I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. No parole. The gasp was immediate. rippling through the gallery like a sudden gust of wind. A few people exchanged stunned glances, while others let out audible murmurs of disbelief. Ethan's reaction was immediate, his face drained of color, his once confident demeanor crumbling as reality crashed down on him. He turned to his lawyer, his voice cracking. "That's not possible," he stammered. "I'll appeal." But Judge Lee was unmoved. Her expression remained resolute, her gaze unwavering. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson." Bailiffs removed the defendant. For a split second, Ethan sat frozen, as if he still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. Then, as the bailiffs stepped toward him, the fight returned to his eyes. He jerked back, his chair screeching against the floor. "You can't do this to me," he shouted. "Do you know who I am?" But his words fell on deaf ears. The bailiffs gripped his arms, their hold firm, dragging him to his feet. He struggled briefly, but there was nowhere left to run. His power, his influence, none of it mattered anymore. As he was escorted toward the exit, the room erupted into applause. Some clapped, some cheered softly, and others simply nodded, their eyes wet with vindication. Angela Martinez sat in the front row, her hands clasped together as she let out a slow, relieved breath. Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter, exhaled sharply, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. Ethan turned his head, searching the crowd for some sign of sympathy, some flicker of support. He found none. The applause grew louder, swelling like a tide of long-awaited justice. The moment felt almost surreal, after all the delays, the legal maneuvering, the arrogance Ethan had displayed throughout the trial. He was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Judge Lee remained composed, allowing the moment to settle before offering a final remark. "Let this serve as a reminder," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "that no one, not wealth, not power, not influence, is above the law." With that, she stood, gathering her papers as the courtroom continued to hum with energy. Ethan's shouting faded as he disappeared through the side doors, his protests swallowed by the walls of the justice system he had once believed he could manipulate. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to capture the reactions of those who had waited for this day. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions poured out. Angela Martinez, standing on the courthouse steps, wiped at the corner of her eye before facing the press. "This isn't just about punishment," she said, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else suffers the way we did." Peter Vaughn placed a firm hand on her shoulder, nodding in agreement. "Justice was served today," he said simply. Inside her chambers, Judge Lee removed her robe, folding it neatly over the back of her chair. She had presided over many cases in her career, but this one would linger, not because of the crime, nor the verdict, but because of what it meant to the people who had lost everything. Justice wasn't just about the sentence. It was about restoring faith. And today, in that courtroom, faith had been restored. Outside the courthouse, Angela Martinez stood still for a moment, letting the crisp air wash over her. She wiped at the tears that had slipped down her cheeks, not out of sorrow, but out of something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The weight she had carried for so long, the sleepless nights, the endless worry, they would never fully disappear. But today, there was something new in its place: hope. "We'll never get back what we lost," she admitted, her voice steady but soft. "But today we have hope." Beside her, Peter Vaughn nodded, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He had been silent for much of the trial, absorbing each moment with quiet determination. But now, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just a bit. "It's not just about punishing him," he said, looking out over the sea of reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. "It's about proving that no one is untouchable." Around them, cameras flashed, microphones were pushed forward, but neither Angela nor Peter paid them much mind. They had already said everything that needed to be said in the courtroom. Now, all that mattered was moving forward. Inside, Judge Monica Lee remained seated in her chambers, staring out the window at the city beyond. The lights flickered against the darkening sky. Cars weaving through the streets, people going about their lives. Cases came and went, trials ended, verdicts were handed down. But this one meant something different. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about reminding the world that power does not excuse corruption, that no matter how much money or influence one might wield, there are lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply before turning away from the window. The job wasn't done. There would be more cases, more trials, more people searching for justice in a world that so often felt tilted in favor of the powerful. But today, at least for now, the scales had balanced, if only a little. And so, I ask you, do you believe justice was truly served? Or do you think billionaires will always find a way out? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share your perspective, because conversations like these matter. And if you believe in holding the powerful accountable, if you believe in stories that challenge corruption and demand justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Because this is just the beginning.